Picture this. It is August of 1990. The intelligence reports hitting the desks at the Pentagon are not just grim, they are downright terrifying. We are staring down the barrel of the fourth largest military machine on the planet. 1 million battle-hardened troops, flushed with combat experience from an 8-year meat grinder with Iran. Over 5,000 main battle tanks, 10,000 armoured vehicles, and an artillery corps that outnumbered ours by a staggering margin. The ghost of Vietnam is still whispering in the ears of American generals, and now a dictator sitting on 20% of the world's oil reserves has just swallowed a sovereign nation in a matter of hours. The question wasn't just how to push him out. The question was how to annihilate his center of gravity without sending 10,000 American boys home in flag-draped transfer cases. Welcome back to the channel, where we dissect the raw mechanics of warfare, strategy, and the steel that shapes history. If you want to understand the brutal geometry of combat and the logistical miracles that win wars, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and let us know in the comments which battle you want us to tear apart next. To understand the sheer scale of the violence that was about to be unleashed in the desert, we have to rewind the clock and look at the strategic bedrock of the Middle East. Saddam Hussein did not just wake up one morning and decide to invade Kuwait on a whim. The roots of this conflict were buried deep in the toxic soil of the Iran-Iraq War, a brutal trench warfare slugfest that raged from 1980 to 1988. That war was a catastrophic drain on Iraqi blood and treasure. Saddam had borrowed heavily to finance his military machine, racking up billions of dollars in debt, with a massive chunk of that owed to his southern neighbors, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. When the war ended, Iraq was functionally bankrupt, despite sitting on an ocean of crude oil. Saddam demanded that Kuwait forgive the $14 billion debt, arguing that Iraq had acted as the shield for the Arab world against the Iranian Revolution. Kuwait refused. To make matters worse, Kuwait was overproducing its OPEC oil quotas, driving the global price of crude down to around $14 a barrel. For a nation like Iraq, which relied on oil for 90% of its export revenue, this was economic strangulation. Saddam also accused Kuwait of slant drilling across the border into Iraq's Rumaila oil field, effectively stealing Iraqi oil. The diplomatic rhetoric escalated, but the West largely viewed it as typical Middle Eastern posturing. That was a fatal miscalculation. Why did Saddam Hussein, a man who just survived a brutal 8-year war of attrition, think he could take on a coalition backed by the sole remaining superpower? The answer lies in a fatal misreading of American political will and a dangerous overconfidence in Soviet-style military mass. Saddam looked at the United States and saw a nation still deeply scarred by the jungles of Vietnam. He believed that the American public had zero tolerance for high casualties. He famously told the American ambassador that the United States could not stomach 10,000 dead soldiers in the desert. He was relying on the strategy of a bloody stalemate. If he could inflict enough pain, if he could drag the Americans into a grinding war of attrition in the sand, the political will in Washington would collapse. It was a gamble based on the premise that quantity has a quality all its own. On August 2, 1990, the Iraqi Republican Guard crossed the border. 3 armored divisions spearheaded the assault, rolling down a 6-lane highway straight into Kuwait City. Within 2 days, the Kuwaiti military was crushed, its royal family had fled, and Iraqi tanks were massing on the border of Saudi Arabia. This was the nightmare scenario for the Pentagon. The Carter Doctrine, established in 1980, explicitly stated that the United States would use military force to defend its national interests in the Persian Gulf. If Saddam pushed into Saudi Arabia, he would control nearly half of the world's proven oil reserves. It would give him a stranglehold on the global economy. President George H.W. Bush drew a line in the sand, and Operation Desert Shield was born. What followed was the greatest logistical miracle since the Second World War. Moving an army across an ocean is not just about putting men on planes, it is about moving the Iron Mountain. We are talking about relocating an entire armored corps, complete with thousands of 68-ton tanks, self-propelled artillery, attack helicopters, and the millions of gallons of fuel required to keep them running every single day. The Military Airlift Command and the Military Sealift Command went into overdrive. Fast sealift ships, capable of cruising at 33 knots, were loaded to the brim at ports in Savannah and Houston, steaming toward the Saudi ports of Ad-Dammam and Al-Jubail. To put this in perspective, imagine the logistical nightmare of Operation Torch during World War II, when the Allies invaded North Africa. Now, multiply the weight of the vehicles by a factor of 3, and factor in the absolute necessity of microchip-controlled supply chains. The desert environment was a ruthless enemy. Temperatures soared to 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade. The sand in Saudi Arabia is not like beach sand. It is a fine, abrasive powder, like talcum, that gets into turbine engines, gun breeches, and optics, grinding down precision machinery with terrifying speed. How do you maintain a high-tech, digitized army in an environment actively trying to destroy your equipment before the enemy even fires a shot? The answer is a logistical tale that stretched thousands of miles, delivering massive air filters, specialized lubricants, and an endless stream of bottled water. The American soldier requires a minimum of 3 to 4 gallons of water a day just to survive in that heat, let alone fight. The logistical footprint was staggering, but it bought time for the combat power to assemble. Let us look at the enemy waiting across the berm. The Iraqi army in 1990 was a massive, heavily mechanized force built on Soviet doctrine and equipped with a mix of Soviet, Chinese, and French hardware. At the top of the food chain was the Republican Guard. These were Saddam's elite, the regime's Praetorian Guard. Divisions like the Tawakkalna, the Medina, and the Hammurabi were heavily armored and well-equipped. Their primary fist was the T-72 M1 main battle tank. On paper, the T-72 was a formidable machine. It featured a 125mm smoothbore gun, an autoloader that reduced the crew to 3 men, and a low profile that made it hard to hit. Many of these tanks were locally assembled in Iraq and dubbed the Lion of Babylon. However, they suffered from critical flaws. The armor was downgraded export quality. They lacked advanced thermal imaging, relying instead on active infrared spotlights that lit them up like Christmas trees to anyone with night vision. And that autoloader, which stored ammunition in a carousel directly under the turret, created a fatal vulnerability. A penetrating hit would ignite the ammunition, resulting in a catastrophic explosion that blew the turret straight off the chassis, a phenomenon known as the jack-in-the-box effect. Supporting the armor was a massive artillery corps. This was actually the one area where Iraq had a distinct on-paper advantage. They possessed thousands of artillery pieces, including the South African-designed G5 towed howitzer. The G5 was a 155mm gun that could throw a high-explosive shell over 24 miles, significantly outranging the standard American M198 howitzers of the time. The Iraqis also fielded the Astros II multiple-launch rocket system and possessed a terrifying stockpile of chemical weapons, including sarin nerve gas and mustard agent, which they had ruthlessly used against Iranian human wave attacks and Kurdish civilians. The Iraqi defensive doctrine was a hybrid of Soviet echelon defense and their own experiences from the Iran-Iraq War. They built the Saddam Line. This was a formidable barrier of sand berms, anti-tank ditches and minefields stretching across the Kuwaiti-Saudi border. They laid millions of landmines. Behind the minefields were fire trenches connected to underground pipes ready to be flooded with crude oil and ignited to create impenetrable walls of flame and thick black smoke. The Iraqi infantry was dug into deep bunkers, with artillery pre-sighted on the expected kill zones. Behind the infantry lines sat the regular army armoured divisions in static, dug-in positions, their tanks buried in the sand up to their turrets to act as pillboxes. And lurking behind them, held in reserve, were the mobile armoured formations of the Republican Guard, ready to counterattack any coalition breakthrough. It was a defense designed to bleed the Americans dry. Could a static defense, no matter how deeply entrenched, withstand the full weight of a digitized, highly mobile Western military? History told us the Maginot Line failed against German maneuver warfare in 1940. But the Iraqi berms were backed by thousands of mobile armoured reserves, waiting to plug the gaps. The Pentagon knew that a frontal assault into the teeth of the Saddam Line would result in a bloodbath. They needed a different approach. They needed a doctrine that was born from the ashes of Vietnam and forged for the plains of Western Europe. That doctrine was air-land battle. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the United States Army completely overhauled its way of fighting. Faced with the terrifying prospect of a massive Soviet armoured thrust through the Fulda Gap in West Germany, American planners realized they could not win a war of attrition against the Red Army. They had to fight outnumbered and win. Air-land battle focused on seizing the initiative, deep strikes, and the seamless synchronization of air and ground forces. It relied on speed, maneuver, and overwhelming violence of action to paralyze the enemy's command and control. The desert of the Middle East, vast, open, and flat, provided the perfect canvas for a doctrine designed for the plains of Europe. The spearhead of this doctrine was the M1A1 Abrams main battle tank. The Abrams was a beast unlike anything the world had ever seen. Weighing in at nearly 68 tons, it was protected by classified Chobham composite armor, reinforced with a mesh of depleted uranium, making it virtually impervious to the frontal fires of Iraqi T-72s. Under the hood was a Honeywell AG-T1500 gas turbine engine. While it guzzled jet fuel at an alarming rate of roughly 3 gallons per mile, it gave this massive steel leviathan the ability to sprint across the desert at over 45 miles per hour. It was so quiet compared to diesel tanks that troops called it the Whispering Death. But the true lethality of the Abrams lay in its main gun and its optics. It mounted a German-designed 120mm M256 smoothbore cannon. When firing, the M829 armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding sabot round, affectionately known as the Silver Bullet, it launched a dart of solid depleted uranium at over 3,500 miles per hour. The kinetic energy was so immense it would punch through a T-72, vaporize the crew, and sometimes exit the other side. Crucially, the Abrams was equipped with advanced thermal imaging sights. While the Iraqis were blind in the dark or in sandstorms, American gunners could see the heat signatures of Iraqi tanks from miles away, day or night, through smoke and weather. Riding alongside the Abrams was the M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. Armed with a 25mm Bushmaster chain gun and twin TOW anti-tank missile launchers, The Bradley was fast enough to keep up with the tanks and packed enough firepower to destroy enemy armor on its own. For artillery support, the coalition brought the M270 multiple launch rocket system. A single MLRS launcher could fire 12 rockets in under a minute, blanketing an area the size of a square mile with thousands of submunitions. It was so devastating that Iraqi prisoners of war would later refer to it as Steel Rain, while American troops simply called it the Grid Square Removal System. But the ground forces were only one half of the equation. The coalition air armada was a technological marvel designed to dismantle the enemy's nervous system. The crown jewel of this air armada was the F-117 Nighthawk. Born from the highly classified Have Blue program, the F-117 looked like an angular flying wedge. Its faceted surfaces were designed to scatter radar waves, giving this attack jet the radar cross-section of a golf ball. It was completely invisible to Iraqi air defense screens. Armed with 2,000-pound laser-guided bombs, the Nighthawk was designed to fly into the most heavily defended airspace on Earth, drop its payload with pinpoint accuracy down the ventilation shaft of a command bunker, and slip away before the enemy even knew they were under attack. Commanding this massive coalition force was General Norman Schwarzkopf, a massive, imposing figure known as the Bear. Schwarzkopf was a Vietnam veteran who understood the brutal reality of combat and the absolute necessity of overwhelming force. He knew that the Iraqi command structure was rigid, top-down, and driven by fear. Saddam Hussein did not tolerate failure, and his officers were terrified to show initiative or make decisions without authorization from Baghdad. Schwarzkopf saw this as their fatal weakness. How do you blind a centralized command structure that relies entirely on landlines and microwave relays? You do not just bomb the front lines, you decapitate the central nervous system before the body even knows it is in a fight. You sever the head from the limbs. The American strategy was not to push the Iraqis out of Kuwait. It was to trap them, blind them, and systematically obliterate their ability to wage war. The United States 7th Corps, commanded by General Frederick Franks, was the heavily armored fist designated for the main effort. This corps included some of the most storied units in American military history, including the 1st Infantry Division, known as the Big Red One, the 1st Armored Division, Old Ironsides, and the 3rd Armored Division, Spearhead. They were joined by the British 1st Armored Division, the legendary Desert Rats. The pieces were on the board. The largest assembly of heavy armor since the Battle of Kursk in 1943 was sitting in the searing heat of the Saudi desert, engines idling, waiting for the order. Saddam's elite Republican Guard sat dug into the sand, confident that their oil-filled trenches and overlapping fields of fire would turn the desert into a graveyard for American tanks. But what the Iraqi High Command did not realize was that the war they had prepared for was already obsolete, and the sky above them was about to be torn apart by an invisible enemy that would rewrite the rules of modern warfare forever. At 2:38 a.m. on January 17, 1991, the pitch-black sky over the Iraqi desert was shattered by the sound of rotors. Task Force Normandy, a highly classified element of 8 AH-64 Apache attack helicopters flying just 20 feet off the deck to avoid radar, unleashed a barrage of AGM-114 Hellfire missiles. Their targets were 2 early warning radar installations near the Saudi-Iraqi border. The missiles struck with devastating precision, vaporizing the radar dishes and blowing a 20-mile-wide blind spot into the Iraqi air defense grid. Through that invisible corridor poured a massive armada of coalition strike aircraft. The air war had begun, and the Iraqi central nervous system was about to be methodically dismantled. Leading the strike into the heart of Baghdad were the F-117 Nighthawks. The Iraqi capital was defended by the Qari system, a deeply integrated, computerized air defense network built by the French, linking hundreds of surface-to-air missile sites and thousands of anti-aircraft artillery pieces. The night sky over Baghdad lit up with tracer fire so thick it looked like a solid wall of deadly neon. But they were firing blind. The Nighthawks, practically invisible to radar, slipped right through the barrage. They dropped 2,000-pound GBU-27 Paveway 3 laser-guided bombs directly through the roofs of telecommunications centers, military headquarters, and power grids. Compare this to the skies over Hanoi during Operation Linebacker 2 in 1972. Back then, American B-52 bombers had to fly in massive formations, relying on brute force and electronic jamming to survive. And we still lost dozens of aircraft to Soviet-built SA-2 missiles. Now, less than 20 years later, a single stealth fighter could do the job of an entire bombing wing with absolute impunity. The technological leap was staggering. How do you fight a coordinated war when your eyes and ears are blown out in the first 10 minutes? You do not. You just sit in the dark and wait to die. By dawn, Saddam Hussein's ability to communicate with his field commanders in Kuwait was effectively severed. The rigid, top-down Iraqi command structure was paralyzed. But the air campaign did not stop at decapitation. For 39 straight days, coalition aircraft pounded the Iraqi ground forces in Kuwait and southern Iraq. B-52 Stratofortresses rained unguided munitions on the Republican Guard, psychologically breaking the elite troops through relentless, earth-shattering bombardment. Meanwhile, A-10 Warthogs roamed the desert, utilizing their 30mm GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannons to chew through the thin top armor of dug-in T-72 tanks. The A-10 pilots called it tank plinking. To the Iraqi conscripts trapped in the sand, it was a waking nightmare. While the Air Force owned the sky, the United States Army was busy winning the artillery duel. The Iraqis believed their South African-built G5 howitzers, with a range of 24 miles, would allow them to shell American assembly areas from a safe distance. They were wrong. The Americans deployed the AN/TPQ-36 Firefinder radar system. This was a piece of technology that completely changed the geometry of the battlefield. When an Iraqi artillery battery fired a shell, the Firefinder radar tracked the projectile in mid-air, calculated its exact trajectory, and determined the precise point of origin before the Iraqi shell even hit the ground. That grid coordinate was instantly transmitted to American M270 multiple launch rocket systems and M109A2 Paladin self-propelled howitzers. Within 2 minutes of pulling their lanyards, the Iraqi gun crews were obliterated by a massive counter-battery barrage of steel rain. The Iraqi artillerymen quickly learned that firing their weapons was a death sentence. Their massive artillery advantage was silenced by American microchips. Under the cover of this relentless aerial and artillery bombardment, General Norman Schwarzkopf executed one of the most audacious logistical maneuvers in military history. He called it the Hail Mary, or the left hook. The Iraqi defensive line was heavily fortified along the Kuwaiti border, expecting a direct amphibious assault from the Marines and a frontal push by the army. Schwarzkopf instead moved the entire 7th Corps and 18th Airborne Corps over 250 miles to the west, deep into the featureless Saudi desert. Think about the sheer scale of this movement. We are talking about relocating hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of 68-ton Abrams tanks, Bradley fighting vehicles, and the millions of gallons of fuel required to sustain them. It draws a direct parallel to General George S. Patton pivoting his Third Army to relieve Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge in 1944. But Patton moved over a European road network. Schwarzkopf moved an army 3 times heavier across a trackless ocean of sand. This was only made possible by a brand new, highly classified technology called the Global Positioning System. American commanders used heavy, brick-sized GPS receivers called SLGRs, or sluggers, to navigate the featureless void. The Iraqis had left their western flank completely exposed, believing the desert was impassable for a large mechanized force. They were about to find out that American armor does not care about geography. What happens when a static defense line, built for a bloody frontal assault, suddenly realizes a mechanized juggernaut is driving right around its flank? Complete tactical collapse. On February 24, 1991, G-Day, the ground war commenced. While the Marines launched a fierce fixing attack directly into Kuwait to hold the Iraqi army's attention, the massive armored fist of 7th Corps crossed the berm to the west, driving north into Iraq to swing eastward and crush the Republican Guard. Breaching the Saddam Line was a masterclass in mechanized violence. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, led the assault. They did not stop to clear trenches with infantrymen and bayonets. They used physics and high explosives. Combat engineers fired MICLICs, mine-clearing line charges. Each MICLIC launched a rocket, dragging a line of 1,750 pounds of C4 explosive across the minefields. The detonation created a massive overpressure wave that detonated buried mines, clearing a lane wide enough for a tank. Once the lanes were clear, Abrams tanks, equipped with massive mine plows and M9 armored combat earth movers, charged forward. When they reached the complex network of Iraqi fire trenches, they did not engage in a drawn-out firefight. The armored bulldozers simply drove along the lip of the trenches, pushing thousands of tons of desert sand directly on top of the defending Iraqi infantry. It was brutal, it was highly controversial, and it was incredibly effective. The defensive lines were shattered in a matter of hours, with practically 0 American casualties. As 7th Corps pushed deeper into Iraq, the weather turned against them. A massive shamal, a severe Middle Eastern sandstorm, swept across the battlefield. Visibility dropped to less than a few hundred feet. Rain mixed with the blowing sand, turning the desert floor into a muddy, blinding soup. For a standard army, this weather would force a halt to all offensive operations. But the United States military in 1991 was not a standard army. The thermal imaging sights on the Abrams and Bradley vehicles cut straight through the blowing sand and darkness. The Iraqi tank crews, sitting in their T-72s, were completely blind. They had no idea the Americans were moving. This technological mismatch culminated on February 26th at a map coordinate known as 73 Easting. The 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, acting as the scouting screen for 7th Corps, was pushing east through the howling sandstorm. Leading the charge was Eagle Troop, commanded by Captain H.R. McMaster. Eagle Troop consisted of 9 M1A1 Abrams tanks and 12 M2 Bradley fighting vehicles. As they crested a subtle rise in the desert terrain, the thermal sights in McMaster's tank suddenly lit up with dozens of hotspots. They had driven directly into the assembly area of the Tawakalna Division, one of the most elite armored units in the Republican Guard. The Iraqi tanks were in prepared defensive positions, facing west, waiting for the Americans. Would you halt your advance, pull back behind the ridge, and wait for artillery support? Or would you charge headlong into a brigade-sized element of dug-in enemy armor? McMaster chose violence. He ordered his troop to attack immediately, relying on the shock action and superior gunnery of his crews. The engagement that followed was a slaughter. The mechanics of an Abrams tank engaging a target are a symphony of lethal precision. The tank commander identifies the target through his independent thermal viewer and lays the gun on it. He yells the fire command, "Gunner, sabot, tank." The gunner lases the target. The ballistic computer instantly calculates the range, wind speed, barometric pressure, and the movement of both vehicles, adjusting the gun tube in a fraction of a second. The gunner yells, "Identified," and pulls the trigger. At 73 Easting, the American tanks were moving at 25 miles per hour through a blinding sandstorm, firing on the move. The M1A1 depleted uranium penetrators left the muzzles at over 3,500 miles per hour. The Iraqi T-72s never stood a chance. The kinetic energy of the American rounds punched cleanly through the frontal armor of the Iraqi tanks. The friction superheated the interior, igniting the stored ammunition in the autoloader carousel. One after another, the Iraqi tanks suffered catastrophic ammunition cook-offs. Turrets weighing 12 tons were blown dozens of feet into the air, trailing plumes of fire in the dark. The American human loaders proved far superior to the Soviet mechanical autoloaders. A highly trained Abrams loader was slamming a new 40-pound shell into the breech every 3 to 4 seconds. Eagle Troop was destroying Iraqi tanks faster than the Iraqi commanders could comprehend they were under attack. In just 23 minutes of savage, point-blank armored combat, McMaster's troop of 9 tanks and 12 Bradleys destroyed nearly 50 Iraqi tanks and dozens of armored personnel carriers without suffering a single loss. The Tawakalna division was functionally erased from the order of battle. The sheer speed and violence of the American advance had completely unhinged the Iraqi defense. The surviving elements of the Republican Guard were desperately trying to retreat toward the city of Basra, attempting to escape the tightening noose of the American armored envelopment. But the commanders of the Medina and Hammurabi divisions were not entirely broken yet. They realized they could not win a moving fight against the Abrams, so they set a trap. They found a subtle topographical feature in the desert, a reverse slope, and positioned hundreds of their surviving tanks hull down behind it, waiting for the American armored spearhead to crest the ridge and expose their weaker underbellies. They were setting up the largest and most desperate tank ambush in military history. The trap was set at Medina Ridge. The commanders of the Iraqi Republican Guard had studied the terrain south of Basra and found a subtle, almost imperceptible rise in the desert floor. Behind this reverse slope, they parked over 400 T-72 tanks and armored vehicles of the Medina Luminous Division, digging them in hull down. Only their gun barrels and turrets were exposed above the sand. The strategy was brutally simple. They knew they could not match the targeting speed of the American tanks on the move, so they would wait. They would wait for the American armored spearhead to crest the ridge, exposing the thinner armor on the underside of their hulls against the skyline. It was a classic ambush tactic, reminiscent of the Soviet anti-tank fronts at the Battle of Kursk in 1943, where dug-in defenders waited for the German panzers to drive into a pre-sighted kill zone. But the Iraqis were about to learn a terrifying lesson about the evolution of modern ballistics and the unforgiving nature of American thermal optics. Leading the charge toward Medina Ridge was the United States 1st Armored Division, commanded by Major General Ronald Griffith. They were moving fast, a tidal wave of steel rolling across the desert. As the lead elements of the 2nd Brigade approached the ridge, the Iraqi plan completely unraveled. The Iraqis had assumed that a tank ambush required visual line of sight. They assumed the Americans would only see them when they crested the hill. But the thermal imaging sights on the M1A1 Abrams did not rely on visible light. The idling turbine engines of the Iraqi T-72s were radiating massive amounts of heat into the cool desert air. To the American gunners staring into their green thermal screens, the Iraqi tanks were glowing white-hot through the crest of the sand dune. The Americans did not drive into the kill zone. They stopped short, well outside the effective range of the Iraqi guns. How do you win a gunfight when the enemy can shoot you before you even know they are there? You do not. The American gunners lased the targets, elevated their 120mm smoothbore cannons, and opened fire from an astonishing distance of nearly 2 miles away. The engagement range of the Iraqi T-72 was roughly 1 mile. The Iraqis desperately returned fire, but their 125mm shells fell harmlessly into the sand, hundreds of yards short of the American lines. Meanwhile, the American depleted uranium sabots were crossing the 2-mile gap in under 3 seconds. The kinetic energy was so massive that the rounds punched straight through the sand berms and penetrated the Iraqi tanks hiding behind them. In less than 45 minutes, the 1st Armored Division destroyed over 300 Iraqi tanks and armored vehicles. The Battle of Medina Ridge was the largest tank battle in American history, and it was a completely one-sided slaughter. While the armor was systematically dismantling the Republican Guard on the ground, the sky above was filled with the terrifying silhouette of the AH-64 Apache. Army aviation had evolved far beyond the Huey gunships of the Vietnam War. The Apache was a flying tank killer, equipped with the longbow radar system and armed with 16 M114 Hellfire missiles. These helicopters hovered miles away, hiding behind sand dunes, popping up just long enough to paint an Iraqi tank with a laser designator. The Hellfire missiles, traveling at Mach 1.3, rode the laser beam directly onto the thin top armor of the T-72s, blowing the turrets clean off. The coordination between the ground armor and the attack helicopters was the ultimate realization of air-land battle doctrine. It was a symphony of destruction that the Soviet-trained Iraqi military simply could not comprehend. By February 26th, the Iraqi army in Kuwait had completely collapsed. The order was given from Baghdad to retreat. What followed was one of the most controversial and devastating episodes of the entire war, a scene of apocalyptic carnage on Highway 80, the main road leading from Kuwait City back to the Iraqi border. Tens of thousands of Iraqi soldiers, along with stolen civilian vehicles, buses, fire trucks and tanks, formed a massive bumper-to-bumper convoy trying to flee north. They were spotted by a joint surveillance aircraft, and the coalition air forces descended upon them. Navy A-6 intruders dropped cluster bombs at the front and the rear of the convoy, effectively boxing the massive column in. There was nowhere to go. The highway was elevated above the surrounding marshland, turning the road into a massive, inescapable kill box. For hours, American A-10 Warthogs F-15E Strike Eagles and Marine Harrier jets strafed and bombed the trapped convoy. The devastation was absolute. Thousands of vehicles were turned into twisted, blackened scrap metal. The road became known to history as the Highway of Death. When the images of the charred wreckage and incinerated bodies reached the global press, it sent a shockwave through the international community. The sheer scale of the slaughter raised profound moral questions about the application of overwhelming air power against a retreating, defeated army. Is victory measured merely in ground taken, or is it measured in the total annihilation of the enemy's capacity to ever fight again? President George H.W. Bush and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Colin Powell, looked at the maps and the intelligence reports. The primary objective of the United Nations mandate, the liberation of Kuwait, had been achieved. The Iraqi military had been gutted. To continue the push all the way to Baghdad would mean transitioning from a war of liberation to a war of occupation, fracturing the fragile Arab coalition that the United States had so carefully built. After just 100 hours of ground combat, President Bush ordered a ceasefire. Operation Desert Storm was officially over. The strategic and tactical lessons extracted from those 100 hours fundamentally rewired the global understanding of warfare. For decades, the ghost of Vietnam had haunted the halls of the Pentagon. In the jungles of Southeast Asia, the United States had fought a war of attrition, measuring success by body counts in a theater where the enemy controlled the tempo and the terrain. Desert Storm was the exact opposite. It was a war of decisive maneuver, clear objectives, and the absolute dominance of technology. The coalition forces suffered fewer than 300 combat deaths, while inflicting tens of thousands of casualties on the Iraqi army and destroying over 3,000 main battle tanks. To put this logistical and tactical miracle into perspective, we have to look back at the Red Ball Express of World War II. When General George S. Patton's Third Army broke out across France in 1944, his tanks literally ran out of gas because the supply trucks could not keep up with the speed of the armoured advance. The logistical tether snapped. In Desert Storm, General Norman Schwarzkopf's 7th Corps consumed over 4 million gallons of fuel every single day. A single armoured division required 5,000 tons of ammunition, water, and spare parts daily just to function. The United States military built an iron mountain of supplies in the Saudi desert and utilized a fleet of heavy, expanded mobility tactical trucks to keep the armoured spearhead constantly fueled and rearmed, while moving at 40 miles per hour across a trackless wasteland. The logistical apparatus of the United States proved to be just as lethal as its combat battalions. From an intelligence standpoint, Desert Storm marked the dawn of the information age battlefield. The deployment of the E-8 Joint Surveillance Target Attack Radar System, or JSTARS, gave American commanders a godlike view of the theater. Flying at 30,000 feet, the JSTARS aircraft used synthetic aperture radar to track the movement of every single Iraqi vehicle on the ground in real time, regardless of weather or darkness. Compare this to the Battle of the Bulge in 1944, where massive German armoured columns moved undetected through the Ardennes forest under the cover of winter storms. In 1991, there was nowhere for the Iraqi army to hide. The fog of war had not been eliminated, but it had been severely reduced by American microchips and satellite uplinks. However, the war did not end without immense economic and environmental consequences. As Saddam Hussein's forces retreated from Kuwait, they enacted a scorched earth policy of unprecedented scale. Iraqi combat engineers rigged explosives to over 600 Kuwaiti oil wells, detonating them and setting the desert on fire. The sky turned pitch black at noon. Millions of barrels of crude oil poured into the Persian Gulf, creating the largest oil spill in human history. The fires burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, creating toxic plumes of smoke that could be seen from space. It took international teams of firefighters, using jet engines mounted on tanks to blow out the flames, nearly 10 months to extinguish the inferno. The economic impact was staggering, temporarily disrupting the global energy market and leaving Kuwait with billions of dollars in environmental damage. It was a stark reminder that even in a war dominated by precision weapons, the collateral damage can be catastrophic. The legacy of Operation Desert Storm is etched into the bedrock of modern military doctrine. It proved that a highly trained, professional volunteer army, equipped with digitized communications, stealth technology, and precision-guided munitions, could completely dismantle a massive conscript-heavy force relying on static defenses and outdated Soviet doctrine. It served as a violent wake-up call to nations like China and Russia, who watched in horror as their own military philosophies were rendered obsolete in a matter of hours. The United States had established itself as the undisputed unipolar military hegemon of the world. War is a brutal, unforgiving teacher, and the desert sands of Iraq absorbed lessons written in blood, steel, and depleted uranium. The absolute synchronization of air, land, and logistical power demonstrated in 1991 remains the gold standard for mechanized warfare. As military theorist Karl von Clausewitz once noted, "Blood is the price of victory." In Desert Storm, the United States used overwhelming technological supremacy to ensure that the enemy paid that price in full. Now, we want to hear from you. Which technological advancement do you believe was the absolute most decisive factor in the crushing victory of Operation Desert Storm? Let us know in the comments below. A. The stealth capabilities of the F-117 Nighthawk that decapitated Iraqi command. B. The thermal imaging and depleted uranium rounds of the M1A1 Abrams tank. C. The GPS and logistical supply chain that made the massive left hook possible. Drop your answer and your reasoning in the comments, hit that subscribe button to join the ranks, and stay tuned for our next deep dive into the machinery of war.